There isn't, strictly speaking, much you can miss about the giant lost children. They look like a giant petrified Muppet corpse, they hurl rocks at you, and that's basically it. If you picked up on that, you've got the gist. But there are three aspects of their design that I would like to take a closer look at. The first aspect of the design I'd like to take a look at are these strange, almost bark-like growths that are emanating from the giant lost children's bodies. They don't appear in any kind of consistent or symmetrical pattern, which says to me that this is not a natural feature of their anatomy. I don't know what they're supposed to be, or even if they're supposed to be anything other than an odd piece of design. Given that it's been argued that the nightmare areas we visit are the remnants of the land of Loran, which fell to the beast plague before Yharnam did, it's possible that the giant lost children are carrying some strain of the beast plague, and that is warping their anatomy, causing them to grow these strange scale things. We see beasts that generate lightning and beasts that generate fire, so a beast growing scales or rock or whatever this is isn't that far out of the question. Another possible explanation is the frankly bizarre properties that Bloodborne ascribes to blood. If we look at the description of the bloodstone chunk, it reads, "A solid shard that forms in cold blood. After death, some substances crystallize, but most simply harden and form bloodstones." So we could be looking at a kind of scarring effect here, where the giant lost children have been wounded in these areas. The wound has not closed, and instead it has discharged this blood, which has hardened into this strange rock-like substance. A problem with this, though, is that we see other wounds on the bodies of the giant lost children, and those have not closed, but they have also not discharged the same rocky substance. And those wounds are the second part of the design that I want to talk about. I have seen it argued that the wounds we see on the backs of the giant lost children were actually caused by whips, and that they're being used as a slave race to construct the castle that we find in the Nightmare of Mensis. It's an idea I like, but have problems with. The first one is that if we look at the chests of the giant lost children, they have very, very similar wounds there. They're not just on the backs, where you would expect to see wounds if they were being whipped. To me, these wounds look like the giant lost children simply got in a fight with something, and I think that something might be the Loran Silverbeasts. I'll be covering the Silverbeasts in depth later on in this video, but one of the things about the Silverbeasts is that they have these very long, sharp talons that they rake across you as they're fighting you. And if you look at the wounds on the giant lost children, they look like the kind of wounds, very long, very deep cuts that would be caused by something with very, very sharp talons that it is slashing with. The other problem I have with the giant lost children being responsible for creating this castle is that to me it just looks like an existing place that was recreated in the dream world in the same way that the hunter's dream was. Now, we visit the real-world origin of the hunter's dream when we find the abandoned old workshop. We don't do it here, but it's possible this is simply somewhere that's far away from Yharnam, or it could be part of Yahar'gul that we simply never visit. The castle is also filled with extremely complex mechanisms, and there's a real precision to the architecture, which seems far beyond the intellectual level that the giant lost children are operating on, and also their manual skill. They're very clumsy. So I think even with Mensis overseeing them, this species could not have constructed this castle. I think at best they could have been used to quarry stone, but since we see places recreated in the dream world from real world places, I think Occam's razor says that this was recreated mentally by Mensis. But this talk of the perceived intelligence of the giant lost children brings me to the third and final aspect of their design I want to discuss, which is the fact that they do seem to be wearing shoes. Here, helpfully demonstrated by one that got stuck in a wall. The first time I saw these, I thought that they were actually bindings and that this was further evidence that the giant lost children were being used as slaves. But if you look up closely, they are in fact a form of footwear. Closer to socks than shoes, but it's clearly footwear. So we're dealing with a species that, despite us not seeing any evidence of rationality or intelligence or social organization or any kind of culture or language, are intelligent enough to find and use tools. And this is where inevitably, I bring in Lovecraft. I want to clarify that, at least as I see it, the influence that Lovecraft had on Bloodborne comes in the form of imagery and ideas and concepts that are riffed on, rather than direct parallels. So, the giant lost children, like most of the creatures that we will run into, are not directly analogous to a specific Lovecraft creature as much as they are a collection of traits that Lovecraft ascribed to creatures. The first source I'm going to look at is a story Lovecraft wrote called The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, which is one of his longer stories. It's the source of a lot of the imagery we see not just in the Nightmare realm, but interestingly also in the Hunter's Dream, and I'll come to that when I come to the Hunter's Dream. But for now I want to look at a creature from the Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath called the Ghast. When the protagonist of the Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath comes across a Ghast for the first time, we're given this description. After a moment, something about the size of a small horse hopped out into the grey twilight, and Carter turned sick at the aspect of that scabrous and unwholesome beast, whose face is so curiously human, despite the absence of a nose, a forehead, and other important particulars. Now, giant lost children are not ghasts. That's quite obvious when you look at the description of the Ghast as hopping, and if you read Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, Lovecraft actually likens them to kangaroos. But what I did think was interesting was the way that Lovecraft describes the Ghast as having these very flat, very featureless faces that nevertheless look human, which is a very good fit for what we see of the giant lost children. Another creature from the Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath that I think also could have been an inspiration are the ghouls. Lovecraft uses ghouls very frequently in his work, and he seems to draw on a kind of Middle Eastern interpretation of the ghouls as a sort of human hyena hybrid that eats the dead. So I'm going to use a description that Lovecraft gives us in a story called Pickman's Model. These figures were seldom completely human, but often approached humanity in varying degree. Most of the bodies, while roughly bipedal, had a forward slumping and a vaguely canine cast. The texture of the majority was of a kind of unpleasant rubberiness. When the ghouls reappear in Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, they are described again as rubbery, dog-like lopers. So I would say that, with reference to the Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, the giant lost children come across as a composite creature. They have the featureless human faces that the Ghasts have, but they don't have the Ghasts' kangaroo-like hopping bodies. Instead, they have the forward-hunching, but still roughly humanoid bodies that the ghouls are described as having. Now you'll notice I said with reference to Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, because while I'm absolutely certain that Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath was a definite inspiration for Bloodborne, there is another Lovecraft story that I would like to look at with reference to specifically the giant lost children, and I'm not sure if it was an influence or not, but it did strike me. And that story is called The Lurking Fear. And what I think is particularly interesting about the Lurking Fear, with reference to the giant lost children, is the way in which the monsters in it are described. The protagonist of the Lurking Fear describes the creatures in it like this. The object was nauseous, a filthy, whitish gorilla thing with sharp yellow fangs and matted fur. It was the ultimate product of mammalian degeneration, the frightful outcome of isolated spawning, multiplication, and cannibal nutrition above and below the ground, the embodiment of all the snarling and chaos and grinning fear that lurk behind life. Now, what Lovecraft is talking about here is not an alien cosmic horror. He's actually talking about an extremely inbred human being, a member of a family who sealed themselves away for so long that through these consecutive generations of inbreeding and a lack of human contact, they, to use Lovecraft's word, degenerated into this kind of primitive Neanderthal ape state. And what's also interesting is that we know at least one of the ghouls in Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath was at one point a human being as well. And that ghoul is actually the title character, though not the protagonist, of Pickman's Model. When he is encountered in Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, we get the following description. There, on a tombstone of 1768, stolen from the Granary Burying Ground in Boston, sat the ghoul which was once the artist Richard Upton Pickman. It was naked and rubbery, and had acquired so much of the ghoulish physiognomy that its human origin was already obscure, but it still remembered a little English, and was able to converse with Carter in grunts and monosyllables. I think this is an interesting line of thought to look at, with reference to the argument that the nightmare areas are the remnants of Loran after it fell to the beast plague. We see Silverbeasts there, which are clearly beasts, and we see the giant lost children. So it's possible that the giant lost children are not beasts, but are in fact the descendants of the original inhabitants of Loran. Though they may have survived and escaped becoming beasts themselves, without a culture, without a civilization, without knowledge, they regressed into this almost animal Neanderthal state. This is, I'd like to point out, a very, very reactionary view of human nature, but it is a view of human nature that Lovecraft did seem to hold. And we do see echoed in Bloodborne in characters like Willem and Mikolash. The obvious jumping off point when discussing Loran Silverbeasts is the way that they generate lightning from their hides in the same way that we see Dark Beast Parl and the Abhorrent Beast do so. However, this is something that's already been discussed, it's already been elaborated on at length by other people who have more interesting things to say about it than I can possibly fit in this. I'll put some annotations up. And also the point of these videos is to get up close and look at things that aren't immediately apparent when you first play through the game and you're just trying not to get killed. So I don't really want to look at the lightning in this video, I might come back to it another time, but for now I want to look at the actual visual design of the Loran Silverbeasts. When I discussed the giant lost children, I talked about how they, and a lot of other things in Bloodborne, they reference Lovecraft, they draw on Lovecraft, and they are composites of Lovecraftian ideas without actually being lifted from Lovecraft's fiction. In the case of the Loran Silverbeasts, though, I feel like there is a very obvious single source that they have been inspired by, and that is the Gugs from, again, the Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath. I will now read Lovecraft's description of the Gugs. It was a paw, fully 2.5 feet across and equipped with formidable talons. After it came another paw, and after that, a great black third arm to which both of the paws were attached by short forearms. Then 2 pink eyes shone, and the head of the awakened Gug sentry, large as a barrel, wobbled into view. The eyes jutted 2 inches from either side, shaded by bony protuberances overgrown with coarse hairs. But the head was chiefly terrible because of the mouth. That mouth had great yellow fangs and ran from the top to the bottom of the head, opening vertically instead of horizontally. Now, there are obviously key differences between the Gug and the Loran Silverbeasts, chiefly the hair being white on the Silverbeast, while Gugs are described as having very dark hair, and also the Gugs described as having these very oddly structured arms where each elbow actually has 2 forearms attached to it. But the vertically opening mouth and the huge talons are, I think, a pretty good giveaway that the Gug was the chief inspiration behind the Loran Silverbeast. The interesting thing about the Silverbeasts having vertical mouths is that if you get up close to them, you can see that it's not actually a vertical mouth. It's a horizontal mouth, and their heads are in fact tilted 90 degrees when they're standing. So what we have here, again, is, I think, the designers taking an image or an idea from Lovecraft, in this case the creature with a vertical mouth, and running with it in their own way. So we have a creature that it does not actually have a vertical mouth, but instead it appears to have a vertical mouth because its head is tilted on a 90-degree angle, which I actually think makes it look a lot creepier and more disturbing than if it simply had a vertical mouth normally. The talons are also, to me, another very interesting piece of design that, again, I didn't fully comprehend the first time I played it, because, again, I was just trying not to get killed. If you get up close and take a good look at the talons, they're not actually talons as we would understand them. They're not coming out of the Silverbeast's digits. They're actually coming out of its knuckles. It's actually very similar to what Wolverine has, in that they appear to be retracted inside the Silverbeast's knuckles. But then, when it goes to attack you, the claws actually extend outward. I don't quite understand how this works, because the eventual length of the talons is far, far longer than could conceivably fit inside the Silverbeast's hands and forearms. So it's also possible that rather than retracting and extending the claws may actually be growing and shrinking on their own. It's also worth looking at the Silverbeast's rib cages. If you turn one over, you can get a good look. And the ribs of the Silverbeast are poking through its body, but interestingly, they're not poking through in a manner that suggests that the Silverbeast is starving or the Silverbeast is dead and its flesh is rotted so its ribs are exposed. They're just kind of poking through at these really odd angles, like they have just grown strangely. There are two things that this talk of Silverbeast skeletons has brought to mind. The first is that when we meet Dark Beast Paarl, who is reckoned to be some kind of evolution of the Silverbeasts, he's dead. He's basically just a skeleton with bits of fur stuck to him, and yet he is still able to get up and attack us as if he is still alive, despite being a skeleton. The second is the Beast Claw weapon, which is described as crafted by chiseling the long bones of an undead dark beast and fastening them to the weapon. The bones are still alive, and when unleashed, grant its wielder a spurt of beastly power. So what we have here are repeated references to the power of dark beasts being somehow contained in the bones rather than the blood. And the defining feature of the Silverbeasts does appear to be this very, very strange bone structure. Aside from their anatomy, I also want to talk about the relationship that the Silverbeasts appear to have with these monoliths that we find around the nightmare areas, because it's an aspect that I think may also have been lifted from the Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath. When we enter the Nightmare Frontier, one of the first things that we see is a Silverbeast that's seated in front of one of these monoliths. And it's worth looking at that particular piece of enemy placement in light of what Lovecraft says about Gugs, because Gugs are described as worshipping their gods using monoliths and circles of standing stones. To quote from Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, "The Gugs, hairy and gigantic, once reared stone circles in that wood and made strange sacrifices to the other gods." There is also talk of the journey you must take to the city of the Gugs, forcing you to traverse through what are called isles of monoliths and a forest of monoliths. So, although we don't see any other Silverbeasts in front of monoliths, that particular one to me seemed like it may have been inspired by the description of the Gugs worshipping at monoliths. Silverbeasts are also shown to understand fire. We see them holding these burning sticks, and as there aren't any fires around which they could have got the burning sticks from, I think it's fair to say that they do understand fire and do seem, compared to other beasts, to be quite lucid. This degree of lucidity does seem to be unique to the Dark Beast or Silverbeast strain of the Beast Plague. If you've ever fought the Afflicted Beggar, you'll know that when he transforms into a beast, not only is he not simply snarling and snapping at you, he's extremely talkative, and some people have said he's actually more insightful and more lucid as a beast than he is as a human.
Rancid beasts, every last one of us.
I have one final point to make about the Silverbeasts, but before I get there, I'd actually like to go back for a bit to the Giant Lost Children. When I talked about the Giant Lost Children, I argued that a possible source of the wounds we see on their bodies are them fighting with the Loran Silverbeast, the wounds being caused by the Talons. And I think it is notable that in Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, the Gugs and the Ghasts are described as fighting each other. So if they are roughly analogous, then that's further evidence to support that interpretation. The final thing I want to talk about is kind of half about the Loran Silverbeast and also half about what the game calls slime scholars, which are creatures you find in the abandoned lecture hall. These do not on the surface appear to have anything in common, but if you look at their animation, there's something very, very striking, which is that the slime scholars appear to move in a very, very similar way to the Silverbeasts. Specifically, the way that they get down on not all fours, because obviously the slime scholars do not have lower extremities, but they get down on their hands and they tilt their heads 90 degrees in a very, very similar way to what the Silverbeasts do. And unless I'm mistaken, no other creatures in the game do that. The slime scholars are also found in a lecture hall which is connected directly to the Nightmare Frontier, where we find the Loran Silverbeasts. The slime scholars also, when they die, usually drop quicksilver, quicksilver being another name for mercury, which presumably their bodies are in fact made from, mercury being a viscous substance and also being a very important substance in alchemy. So in connected areas we have a thing called a Silverbeast and a thing that is made from quicksilver that both seem to like tilting their head 90 degrees. This seems to be significant, but I have no idea what it's getting at. It's entirely possible this is just a reused piece of animation, but the fact that they're located in proximity to each other and that they both have references to silver in them, it is possibly more than a coincidence. The thing about the crawlers is that they're clearly very Lovecraftian in design, these sort of protean, tentacular creatures, but what I find interesting about their design is not the Lovecraftian elements. So I'm going to start by discussing the Lovecraftian elements to basically get it out of the way before I move on to the far more interesting parts. So going back to the Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath again, I think what we have here is another composite, in this case between two creatures called the Moonbeasts and the Beholds. Starting with the Moonbeasts, Lovecraft describes them as, Carter could now distinguish moving figures on the noisome wharves ahead, and the better he saw them the worse he began to fear and detest them, for they were not men at all, or even approximately men, but great greyish-white slippery things which could expand and contract at will, and whose principal shape, though it often changed, was that of a sort of toad without any eyes, but with a curiously vibrating mass of short pink tentacles on the end of its blunt, vague snout. Moonbeasts are not described, though, as simply being monsters. They're actually intelligent creatures with a civilization of their own. Immediately following the physical description I just read out, we get this. These objects were waddling busily around the wharves, moving bales and crates and boxes with preternatural strength, and now and then hopping on or off some anchored galley with long oars in their forepaws. And now and then one would appear driving a herd of clumping slaves, which indeed were approximate human beings, with wide mouths like those merchants who traded in Delath Leen. So while they are alien and incomprehensible in a physical sense, they are clearly intelligent and they have understandable motivations for their actions. This is not true of the Beholds, the description of which I will now read from. Now, Carter knew from a certain source that he was in the Vale of Pnath, where crawl and burrow the enormous bowls, but he did not know what to expect, because no one has ever seen a bowl or even guessed what such a thing may be like. Bowls are known only by dim rumour, from the rustling they make amongst mountains of bones, and the slimy touch they have when they wriggle past one. They cannot be seen, because they creep only in the dark. So I think what we have here is a composite between the Moonbeast and the Behold. The Moonbeasts are described as greyish-white, able to contract and expand their bodies at will, which fits with what we see of the crawlers. However, the Moonbeasts are described as having a body like a toad, whereas the crawlers, when we see them, are closer to an octopus or a starfish. We aren't given a definitive description of the bowls, but We are told that they are slimy and that they burrow and that they wriggle, which suggests something not unlike a worm. And if you're familiar with, we'll call it the Lovecraft expanded universe for lack of a better term, you'll know that bowls, also sometimes called ghouls, are described as being very worm-like. So what we have here is a creature that takes the greyish-white protean expanding, contracting nature of the moon beasts and fuses it with the kind of base animal wrigglingness of the bowls. Now, with that out of the way, I want to talk about the other aspects of its design, which are really, really weird. When the crawler rears up to do its poison cloud attack, you get a very good look at its underside, which has a number of extremely interesting features. The most obvious being that it's covered in messengers. I'm going to do a separate video on the messengers because they actually crop up in a bunch of different monster designs in more subtle ways than this. But what I want to note for now with regard to the messengers is that they just appear to be haphazardly stuck to the bottom of the crawler. Because of the way that they reach out when it does its poison cloud attack, my initial thought was that they were growing from the bottom of the crawler, but if you go up and get a closer look at it, you can see that they are just kind of stuck to it. Here you can quite clearly see that one has its legs just stuck in the air, just kind of kicking. To me, the appearance and the movement of the messengers suggest that they're actually trapped under it. With reference to the poison cloud, though, the interesting thing about the underside of the crawler is that there is no central orifice from which the poison cloud is being expelled. It kind of gives the impression that the gas was pooling under the crawler and then was released when it reared up, except the gas doesn't actually appear until the crawler is fully reared up, so it wasn't there to begin with. It does seem to be released in time with the messengers flailing, so it's possible that they're involved in some way. It does have an orifice in what we'll call its head, but that doesn't seem to have any connection with the gas attack. It just emits this strange screaming sound. But the oddness of the design doesn't stop with the messengers. I actually think the rest of the crawler is, if anything, weirder. The crawler actually appears to be two completely different organisms that are joined together. If we get behind it and look at it from the side, you can see that it does appear to have a tail, but the tail is not coming out of the actual back of the crawler itself. It's coming out the back of the top half of the crawler, while the back of the crawler is just seemingly this mass of organs that the front half drags around with it. The back half does not appear to actually do anything. And you can kind of make out a join. But now let's take a closer look at the crawler when it rears up. Down the bottom, it does look a lot like a pregnant female torso. You can kind of make out breasts and a big pregnant abdomen and what looks like a vaginal opening. It's the sort of like almost Rorschach thing where I would assume I was just seeing something. But given that this is Bloodborne, this may actually be intentional. So we have what looks to be the parts of a female body that are associated with reproduction that this slug thing has either grown out of or parasitized. And on that baffling note, we conclude episode 1 of Bloodborne Up Close. If you learned something you didn't know before, why not Sorry, no, I can't. I hope this was informative, and I hope that if you have your own theories about Bloodborne, that maybe this may have helped you in some way. I don't know how many of these there are going to be, and I don't know how often they're going to come out, but I'm going to try looking at everything in the game in as much detail as I can. I tried to be as exhaustive as possible, but there may have been things I missed. If there were, feel free to tell me, and I will see you next time.